Well, welcome everyone to the final session of the CG conference, the two-day conference for 2023, and the final session of the online conference today. And our final session is a keynote from Sharon Stein from University of British Columbia. I'll introduce Sharon in a moment. Her title is Beyond Business as Usual in University Climate Action. Just a couple of brief protocols first. Remember, the webinar is being recorded. And it will appear on YouTube in the near future, along with all of the other the sessions today, all of which have been in the webinar format. During the webinar, we advise you to leave your mic off. You don't need to use your camera either, although there's no particular problem if you want to turn that on. Your mic, though, can catch extraneous noise, which can disturb the webinar. But of course, when we come to the Q&A part at the end of Sharon's talk, and you're coming into that discussion, turn on your mic at that point and your camera too, if you can. We advise you to use speaker view in the top right-hand corner there. If you want to see who's speaking at any given time, it helps. And if you want to join the discussion, and we really do encourage you to use whatever time we have available for Q&A, indicate that you want to speak by notifying us through the chat. And from there, we'll be able to bring you into the conversation. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, within the Faculty of Education. The author of Unsettling the University, Confronting the Colonial Foundations of US Higher Education. Sharon, I think this book is one of those books which is timeless. It's going to be read in 10, 20 years because it's about a profound foundational issue, and it doesn't date for that reason. And this will change perceptions, understandings of the US model and US higher education long term. It has to have a big impact, and I really appreciate that that you've done that, and I think all of us are really pleased to see it out there. The Johns Hopkins University Press 2022, that's the publishing information. Sharon's bio tells us that she's a white settler scholar whose research asks how education, particularly higher education, can prepare people to respond to wicked social and ecological problems in relevant, responsible, and reparative ways. I think she'll talk about some of those things now. And at this point, let me hand over to you, Sharon. Thank you for coming onto our conference schedule today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone, for you. Good morning for me. I'm delighted to be there with you virtually. I wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous Nations in what is currently known as Vancouver, Canada. If you've been following conversations about decolonization in North America, you might have noticed that acknowledgements like these are becoming increasingly common. You might have also heard critiques of the fact that these acknowledgements have sometimes become really tokenistic exercises that don't necessarily inform the content that follows or really lead to the changing of colonial business as usual. These acknowledgements often treat colonialism as something that happened in the past, something that's settled business. To interrupt that tendency, I just want to emphasize that the displacement, dispossession, and subjugation of Indigenous nations and ecological extractivism on their territories are not just historical events, but continue into the present. And what also continues are the struggles of these nations to have their lands returned to them, their livelihoods restored, and their rights and sovereignty recognized. I also want to name that there are conditions of possibility that allow us to connect virtually today, including, the mining of rare earth minerals that go into our computers that are mined under extremely unethical conditions and ecologically destructive conditions. There's the carbon that's created from the data centers that allow us to connect and these machines to run. And while acknowledging these conditions is a common practice for me, they are especially relevant for my presentation today, because one of the key premises of my talk is that pretty much everything in the daily life of the university is entangled, not just in local and global colonial relations, but also in the wider social, political, and economic systems that are creating climate change and biodiversity loss and other forms of ecological destabilization in the first place. So it's kind of tempting to position ourselves and our institutions as if we were just going to contribute solutions to the climate and nature emergency. And this is understandable, but I would say it's really an incomplete picture. It's likely that our climate action will be ineffective if we don't see how we're also contributing to the problem. Alexa Shotwell points out in her book, Against Purity, quote, there's often an implicit or explicit idea that in order to live authentically or ethically, we should avoid potentially reprehensible results in our actions. Since it's not possible to avoid complicity, however, we do better to start from an assumption that everyone is implicated in the situations we repudiate. And that's the end of the quote. So rather than feel overwhelmed or immobilized by this complicity and harm, my invitation for us is to see if this can activate a sense of responsibility. So my invitation that I'm making today specifically is has three parts. First is if we can consider the limitations and the harmful impacts of approaches to climate action in higher education that are grounded in, business as usual, but greener. The second piece is to examine the implications of analyses that suggest that the root causes and drivers of the climate and nature emergency are colonialism and capitalism. And third is to ask what we could learn from experiments in next practices that try and gesture beyond business as usual in climate action. And I want to emphasize at the outset that I'm not expecting you to agree with everything I present today. It's just to see how it lands for you and what it can do. And if after our time together you feel that what I'm offering is not useful, then you can leave it in the virtual room. There will be no judgment and no hard feelings on my part. So let's start with the basics. Universities are often understood as having a unique role in catalyzing climate action in society. But of course, there's more than one way to approach the climate and nature emergency, more than one way to sort of analyze its root causes and then respond to it as well. And I would say that partly these different layers of analyses and responses has to do with the fact that it is a wicked problem. So a wicked problem is a problem that is complex and multi-layered. It has many different unknowns, and it can only really be addressed through partial, imperfect solutions that don't have any guarantees and that often create new problems and that affect different communities in different ways, which then leads to different ideas about what should be done to address them. Some would even say that the climate and nature emergency is a super wicked problem, which is all the parts about a wicked problem, but also one that is very time sensitive, the idea that time is running out, the fact that those who cause the problem are often the ones trying to fix it, the fact that there's usually a weak central authority to address it, and that often the way we respond to it discounts future impacts. So if we take the climate and nature emergency, or CNE, as a super wicked problem, then we might say it's no surprise that there's different ways people have of responding to it. And I'm specifically going to talk about a distinction between mainstream sustainability and climate action and critical sustainability in climate action. In reality, we could make many different groupings of the different approaches, and each of these categories has, internal diversity within them. But I'm going to use these two categories to try and structure my talk today, understanding that there's limitations to any groupings we could make. So the most prevalent approach to climate action sustainability in higher education is what we might call mainstream. It's usually focused on things like greening campus operations, like encouraging people to recycle more, trying to get LEED certification for new buildings, and supporting any kind of climate-related research or incorporation, especially of climate science, into our classrooms. And I would say one of the most kind of prominent examples of mainstream sustainability in higher education these days is this relatively recent embrace of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So as you all probably know, there's really only one target of the 17 goals that specifically talks about the importance of higher education. Some have called on universities, however, to take on a much more significant role in enabling global society to meet all the SDG targets. And this role has been framed as a natural outgrowth of universities' positions as leading sites of education, innovation, and social change. And in the past few years specifically, many institutions have started to articulate their commitments to supporting the achievements of the SDGs. Some have created voluntary reviews about their progress in supporting the SDGs. I've seen sustainability strategies and internationalization strategies that are framed around the SDGs, and some even put them as part of their sort of university-wide strategic plans. Then, of course, we have the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, which are assessing universities against the SDGs. So despite the kind of growing popularity of the SDGs in higher education, there are more critical scholars and activists who are pointing out the fact that the SDGs are shaped by and oriented toward maintaining the continuity of the same paradigms of progress, development, innovation that underlie our current unsustainable system. The dominant paradigm, the mainstream paradigm of sustainability is really centered on this idea that we can balance continued economic growth with respect for planetary boundaries. Sometimes people talk about this as, the 3 Ps, people, planet, and profit. Jason Hickel, however, points out that there's this assumption there that, we can reconcile economic growth and ecological sustainability through having increased innovations in technologies that will decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. But there's no real empirical proof that that's going to be possible. And thus far, it hasn't really proven true. So as Baskin notes, sustainable development can be understood as an effort to green the existing growth paradigm rather than replace it. And that's what he calls, this idea of business as usual, but greener. Another way to think about this is that it can be understood as grounded in a desire to transcend the unsustainability of our current system without giving anything up, especially for those of us in the global north who have contributed the most to carbon emissions over time. We still want to continue the same levels of consumption that we have. And the tendency is to therefore look for approaches to sustainability that allow that to be possible, whether or not it is realistic and whatever the impacts might be for other communities and for the environment itself. So critical sustainability in climate action draws attention to what they see as the false promises and undesirable premises of mainstream sustainability efforts like the UN SDGs. And specifically, they identify the risks that if we follow this mainstream paradigm, we will reproduce unequal and extractive relationships and resource distribution between systemically dominant and systemically marginalized communities, seek out simplistic solutions to complex problems, and naturalize ethnocentric imaginaries of justice, responsibility, sustainability, and change. So broadly speaking, critical sustainability and climate action understand colonialism and capitalism as root causes and drivers of climate change, and emphasize the imperative for redistribution and reparations in climate action, drawing attention to the fact that the communities that have contributed the least to the climate and nature emergency, for example, through their carbon emissions, are the communities that are most heavily impacted by it and have the fewest material resources to actually respond. Even though they generally have a lot of ideas and knowledge about how we might respond, they're excluded from these mainstream, broad-reaching plans about how to address climate change. And specifically, I want to review some of the, the primary critiques that are offered by critical approaches to sustainability and climate action in higher education. So the first would be the critique that mainstream sustainability acts as a form of institutional greenwashing. The term greenwashing, you've probably heard before, was coined about 35 years ago to characterize efforts of an organization's actions or products that are that claim that an organization's actions and products are environmentally sustainable, when in reality, they continue this unsustainable practices, particularly those premised on perpetual economic growth and profit. Carrie Facer uses greenwashing in a broad way to describe the sort of superficial and symbolic nature of many university sustainability efforts, suggesting that we can no longer, quote, just throw money at greenwashing our activities, a few fair trade coffees, and a little bit of offsetting flights for conferences, and think that this constitutes an adequate response to the changed world we now inhabit. The second critique is the notion that mainstream sustainability is grounded in and reproduces a Eurocentric politics of knowledge when it comes to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about the climate and nature emergency and efforts to address it, and especially in ways that really favor Western scientific and technological knowledge over other kinds of knowledge, in particular Indigenous and other non-Western knowledges. The third critique kind of builds on this critique of Eurocentrism of knowledge and challenges the assumption of mainstream sustainability that this is primarily a technical problem that can be solved with more technological innovations, which this critique suggests fails to address the inherently unsustainable systems that underlie these technologies and that are causing climate change, and specifically that this invisibilizes the role of colonialism, dispossession, and capitalism in creating climate change. The fourth critique challenges the assumption, which guides many sustainability efforts, including the SDGs, that growth-based economies and forms of development are the only viable pathway forward, despite the fact that economic growth continues to require the reproduction and expansion of extractive and exploitative socioeconomic relations and ecological degradation. And the last critique is that all of these above dynamics tend to lead to the imposition of paternalistic solutions by the global North onto the global South and by non-Indigenous people onto Indigenous people, particularly solutions that primarily benefit the former at the expense of the latter, and thereby reproduce all these patterns of exploitation, expropriation, and dispossession. So these solutions are sometimes called false solutions, not just because they benefit wealthier and more powerful communities at the expense of others, but also because they ultimately fail to transform the underlying unsustainability of existing systems and institutions. And examples of this would be, forms of carbon trading that result in the further dispossession of Indigenous lands and the destructive mining that happens through trying to find rare earth minerals, like the lithium that is mined for electric car batteries that rely on exploited labor and the creation of green sacrifice zones to fuel these energy transitions. So I've tried to kind of summarize some of the mainstream and critical climate action approaches, different ideas of what the root causes are for mainstream climate action. It's really about inefficiency and ignorance. We still need more knowledge and more innovation in order to sort of manage nature for human benefit. This is primarily a technical problem versus the critical climate action approach, which says, well, the root cause is actually irresponsibility. We're denying our interdependence with each other and with nature itself. And this is really actually a relational problem. They also have different ideas of what the role of educators is, right? So the first mainstream approach is that we need to provide people with skills and knowledge to generate new solutions and empower themselves to advocate for instance, for policy change, and a particular emphasis on getting people to understand climate science versus critical climate action, emphasizing that we need to prepare people with the capacities to face the limits and harms of the existing system and the complexities involved in trying to change it, and really trying to navigate toward more responsible futures. When it comes to equity, sustainable development goals do have a notion of equity embedded in there and really sort of organized around the idea that more communities should be able to access and enjoy the benefits of the existing system versus the critical climate action that says, well, the existing system is premised on harm. So we need to actually address that harm by redistributing burdens and responsibilities and resources and repay the climate debts that are owed, for instance, by the global North to the global South. When it comes to epistemic difference, mainstream climate action doesn't leave a lot of space for that. It's really seeking sort of a coherent narrative about what we need to do and really de-emphasizing the political nature of knowledge versus critical climate action, which welcomes multiple perspectives, but also tries to draw attention to the fact that certain perspectives are valued more than others. And then finally, the general approach to climate action being the mainstream approach, saying that we need to create more knowledge and innovations so that people can be, quote, happier, healthier, and wealthier, versus the critical climate action that says we need to actually learn how to know and be and relate in very different ways that are more socially and ecologically accountable and that contribute to the collective well-being of all species, both current and future generations. So on the one hand, universities do need to create space for conversations that welcome many different visions about their role in enabling possible futures in the face of the climate and nature emergency. On the other hand, the visions for the future that tend to take up the most space in these conversations are the mainstream approaches that would sustain the status quo. And efforts to amplify more critical perspectives are met with varied responses, including in some cases indifference, in other cases active resistance. And I would say that this resistance can't just be explained by a lack of supporting evidence, right? There's a growing body of research across various fields of knowledge that points to the connections between colonialism, capitalism, and climate change. And this includes, colonialism being mentioned as a driver of climate change in the IPCC reports. There's also several reports from different UN special rapporteurs that address this issue. So I think we need to think about another reason why resistance arises. And one way I would explain this resistance is the fact that acknowledging these connections between colonialism, capitalism, climate change, and our current universities is really difficult, because confronting the implications of those connections means confronting the possibility that our current system and institutions can't be made sustainable or equitable. But universities are, of course, dependent on these systems, right? And many of us who work in higher education, therefore, remain invested in the continuity of this system, even if part of us knows that we're going to be reproducing local and global relationships that are grounded on colonial violence and ecological destruction. As Matthew Durr has observed, students are starting to really insist that universities' contributions, quote, to the cataclysmic effects of climate change are manifestly obvious, and say that their objections will not be placated by greenwashing of our campuses or tepid promises about sustainability, end quote. Now, of course, reorienting university climate action toward more critical approaches is not something that's going to be easy, right? Because we have these kinds of resistances. And moving in this direction would require students and staff and faculty to not just deepen our intellectual capacity to understand these issues, but also expand our emotional capacity to hold, the raw truth of all this, and our relational intelligence that would allow us to actually collectively navigate these difficult, complex realities in more self-implicating ways. And this includes the uncomfortable truth that our institutions and we as individuals have been complicit in colonial violence and ecological destruction. We would need to develop stamina to stay with these complexities and complicities over the long haul, because there are no quick fixes, right, to this wicked problem. And if we approach understanding that we don't already have the answers, but we're rather treating climate action as a site for ongoing inquiry, then we could be focusing on ensuring the quality of our collective learning, right, about this process and the integrity of our relationships as we try to confront climate change together. And in that case, if we approach it as an inquiry that we don't already have the answers to, we might feel paradoxically less overwhelmed or immobilized or seeking comfort, security, and fast solutions, because we know there are none. So we can only just start doing the work, right? So in the remainder of our time together, I want to offer a few examples of efforts to approach university climate action in more critically informed ways. And I'm going to talk about a few case studies. And I would say that each of these case studies meets at least 4 of the following 5 elements of critically engaged climate education. So number 1, being critically informed, right? Attending to these histories and systems and power relations that have led to climate change in the first place. Number 2, being complexity grounded. So really understanding that there are no simple solutions to this wicked problem, that there's many possible solutions and each of them is imperfect. Contextually relevant, so understanding that there's no universal model for how to do climate action. It really depends on the context that we find ourselves in and what is possible and viable and intelligible in that context. 4, being socially and ecologically accountable. And 5, again, this emphasis on it being an ongoing inquiry rather than something that we already have the answers to. So this is a framework that is coming out of the Critically Engaged Climate Education Hub, which is an initiative led by the Hunikui indigenous people of the Amazon in Brazil. And we are trying to work with them to develop frameworks that they think are important, especially for folks in the global north to be attending to when it comes to climate education. So I'm going to use this framework, and that's kind of how I identified these different examples of climate action otherwise in higher education. So I use the frame of next practices rather than best practices because I want to emphasize that, there's no sort of universal best practice. We're trying to learn from what we have done before and think about what comes next, but understanding that there's something after that and so on. So really emphasizing again that this work of imagining and experimenting with and learning from efforts to imagine climate action beyond business as usual is ongoing and emergent and a learning process. And I would say that these are case studies that could be considered sort of ahead of the curve in terms of the overall landscape of sustainability and climate action efforts. So they're sort of pushing the boundaries of what is possible in the university. But again, none of them provides universal or definitive answers because they're all, it's all context specific. What they do offer is imperfect, innovative, and contextually specific experiments to imagine this differently. And when we look at it that way, we can see that there's a lot to be learned from these experiments, including learning from both their successes and their failures, right? Because when we're trying something different, when we're taking a bold approach, we are going to misstep. We're going to have things that don't work. And that's actually okay. That's part of how we learn to do this differently. So I've listed here a few examples of these next practices, case studies that we're sort of looking into, and I'm going to focus on 2 of them today. The first one is from a program that I was involved in, so I feel most prepared to speak about that in detail. And that is something I was involved in as part of the leadership team of a year-long program at the UBC Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. And this institute has traditionally been organized around supporting a very exclusive program for 10 to 12 academics who were excused from their regular faculty duties for a year in order to engage with other colleagues across the university, but primarily focused on their own individual research projects. And the leadership team for this year decided we would try to do something really different, try and see if it's possible as an experiment to use elite spaces like this and universities in general to reorient and invite intergenerational, interdisciplinary engagement with pressing social and ecological issues. And we chose to focus on the climate and nature emergency because this is an issue that will affect everyone, but in very different ways that reflect and are likely to reproduce existing inequities. So we approach the climate and nature emergency as a multi-layered wicked problem without easy answers, but really emphasizing this idea of developing intellectual, affective, and relational capacities to coordinate responses across communities, sectors, and disciplines. And we didn't tell participants in the program how to do this, right? How to approach it in this way, but we offered multiple opportunities for them to engage in conversation and to be more self-reflexive. And specifically, we as the leadership team emphasized that our orientation was to recognize colonialism and capitalism as causes and drivers of the climate and nature emergency, but we never did this in a moralizing way or a way that was coercive. We created an environment of collective educational inquiry when people were consistently invited to expand their capacity to engage with complexity, complicity, uncertainty, and accountability related to these things without being told, what to think or what to do. And one of the ways we invited this ongoing engagement with these issues was to organize the program around 4 guiding principles. And these are, number 1, ethical collaborations. So transdisciplinary, intergenerational, and community relationship building grounded on trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability. 2, intellectual depth. So self-critical and relational rigor, moving beyond common patterns of simplistic solutions, paternalistic forms of engagement, and ethnocentric ideals of sustainability, justice, and change. 3, reparative redistribution. So allocating resources, prioritizing populations most affected by the climate and nature emergency and its precarities, and emphasizing research and research areas with the most urgency and impact, guided by principles of reparation, which is both relational and material. And then 4th, engagement with the UBC University Indigenous Strategic Plan. So deepening our understanding of settler responsibilities and supporting the aspirations of Indigenous scholars and communities. And participants knew about these principles when they signed up to be part of the program in the different cohorts of students, scholars, emeriti, staff, and artists. We had these different cohorts. They all knew about these principles. And when we had funding calls through the program, we actually assessed the funding proposals through these principles, whether or not they met these principles. And we tried to invite engagement with the principles throughout the year. And as you might expect, different participants in the program interpreted the principles differently and showed different levels of commitment, which was really important learning for us as the leadership team and as a whole program to think about, the ambivalent nature of language and the fact that these terms mean different things to different communities, and the fact that many complexities, tensions, and paradoxes arise when we are negotiating these different approaches to problem solving and problem posing and coordination, even when we all share, a general interest in the thematic area of the climate and nature emergency, and even when we can agree on these 4 basic principles. So as the leadership team, we really tried to approach our work with humility and transparency, making our thinking visible and our learning public. And that includes, of course, learning from failures, including our own failures as the leadership team and those of the program overall. Not seeing that as a bad thing, but rather seeing it as good data that can then inform next steps or next practices. So for instance, when it comes to the 4 principles, what we learned was that ethical collaborations were very difficult to do in practice. One of the many reasons was that doing ethical collaborations takes a lot of time, and we only had 1 year, right? So collaborations, not just between the university and researchers and communities, but even amongst and within the cohorts, doing that within a very short period of time was much more challenging than many of us expected. Number 2 was that the kind of intellectual depth we were trying to invite and encourage is something that's not yet common sense. We have, our own disciplinary ideas of what constitutes a particular kind of intellectual rigor, but we were trying to invite people to go beyond that, right? And really emphasize the self-reflexivity and the relational pieces of the intellectual depth. And that was difficult because most people were not used to that in particular disciplines in particular. And then when it came to reparative redistribution, also not yet common sense. And again, people understood this in very different ways. And then finally, when it came to the engagement with the UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan, we understood that this requires a lot of flexibility and commitment and resources to do in a good way, not all of which we had, depending on the context. So overall with the program, what we wanted to show was that universities need to foster another model of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaborative engagement that is multi-generational, that prioritizes an agenda of redistribution, reparations, and restitution, and thereby centers the needs and aspirations of those who have been historically and systemically marginalized, in this case, in relation to climate change. And we try to, practice with a different kind of leadership by having a leadership team instead of just one leader. We try to, again, invite this ongoing reflexive inquiry rather than seeking, one simple answer or imposing consensus, and really trying to commit to enacting equity rather than just making the usual performative statements about it. And we actually have a report that we're publishing soon that tries to treat this as a case study of how it's possible to do things differently without, again, approaching that this is a universal approach or that we have the answers. And again, centering the failures that we learned from and want to share with others so that they can learn from our mistakes as we move forward. One other example I wanted to just highlight briefly of next practices of going beyond business as usual comes from a small liberal arts college in Vermont, which is Sterling College. And in 2019, they actually revised their mission and their vision to, quote, advance ecological thought and action. And the new vision frames education as a force to address critical ecological problems caused by unlimited growth and consumption that is destroying the planet as we have known it, such as fossil fuel dependence and rapid climate change, destruction of biodiversity and loss of wild places, promotion of harmful agricultural practices that threaten human and natural communities, persistence of structural oppression and the impacts of human and ecological well-being, and deterioration of civil society through estrangement from community, nature, and place. And I would say that this mission is fairly unique in the higher education landscape. Of course, it's a small institution, so they're able to make this kind of shift, but they really are trying to draw attention to and perhaps interrupt higher education's historical and ongoing role in causing ecological destruction, and tries to repurpose the college to actually support social and ecological regeneration in the wake of that destruction. So I wanted to close by offering a kind of takeaway, which is an educational tool that can be used to support different groups to develop the kind of intellectual, affective, and relational capacities I was talking about that could help us coordinate critically engaged and contextually relevant responses to major social issues and wicked challenges like the climate and nature emergency, and doing this across communities and sectors and disciplines. This is a tool that was developed by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, of which I'm a founding member. It's a kind of abridged version. I can share the link when I'm done to the full text, but it's made up of a series of 7 steps back and 7 steps forward or aside. And it's trying to invite us to increase our capacity to hold the weight of multiple moving layers of complexity, complicity, and uncertainty as we face these wicked problems like the climate and nature emergency. So the first step back is stepping back from our self-image in order to decenter our egos and center the challenge at hand. 2 is stepping back from one's generational cohort to have a sense of how incoming generations may interpret and experience the challenges we're facing in different ways. 3 is stepping back from the universalization of our social, cultural, economic parameters of normality to understand that our privilege is also a loss of perspective. 4, stepping back from the immediate context and time we're in order to see the wider picture, the historical, structural, and systemic patterns in which we are embedded. 5 is stepping back from normalized patterns of problem solving, problem posing, and relationship building in order to tap the possibilities that are already viable, but probably unimaginable or unintelligible within the mainstream paradigm. 6 is stepping back from the elevation of humanity above the rest of nature in order to consider our entanglement with everyone and everything. And 7 is stepping back from this impulse to find quick fixes in order to expand our capacity not to be immobilized by complexity, complicity, and uncertainty. Then there are the 7 steps forward and aside. So stepping forward with honesty and courage to see what you don't want to see. Stepping forward with humility to find strength in openness and vulnerability. 3, stepping forward with self-reflexivity so that you can read how you're being read in any room and learn to read the room as well to understand the dynamics that are at play and how they're rooted again in those historical and ongoing systems of inequality. 4, stepping forward with self-discipline to do the work that is needed on yourself so that you don't become work for other people. 5, stepping forward with maturity to do what is needed rather than only what you want to do. 6, stepping forward with expanded discernment and attention, increasing the level of care that we engage in proportion to the amount of risk involved. And 7, stepping forward with adaptability, flexibility, stamina, and resilience for the long haul, being prepared to fall, to fail, to have our plans shattered, to have our ideas stretched, to change the course we're moving in, and to actually find joy in the struggle itself rather than an imagined prize at the end. So that's it. I have a few articles that are relevant to what I've been sharing with you today, but I'm really excited to hear your questions. Thank you so much.
And thanks, Sharon. We've a little pause while we shifted our sound system around here. That was really great. I mean, and I like the way you develop the argument. You move from denaturalizing what we accept as normal and desirable, and by talking about the SDGs prominently at that point, I think you really opened up an area which everyone's a little bit complacent and fixated about, and that was really useful. The greening the existing growth paradigm, yeah, and universities are signing up to the SDGs, Times High signing up to the SDGs. We're all signing up to the SDGs. We need to think about what we're doing. And then the way, those little nuggets on the way, like acknowledging our own complicity, having the stamina to stay with that wicked problem. And that's a lifelong issue. It's for all of us. So we're totally involved in that. And sometimes in multiple ways, not just in relation to climate emergency, but in relation to whiteness and colonialism, and the nature of universities and the way their reproductive social character and so on. And then you took us through the examples and the relational models, the importance of ethics and values, which is an increasing theme I'm noticing in our work here at Oxford on higher education. That's becoming quite crucial, I think, thinking about ethics and relationships in teaching and learning and research, but taking that to activism and particularly to relationships across the world. That's really important. This building a kind of complex collective agency, which is always becoming this, the openness of that and the task of that and the never finishedness of that. It's really important to understand that this is what we're in for. And, there's no moment when the revolution is over, and we can step back and say, hey, we did it, we took power and now it's all going to be okay. It's not like that and at all. And the struggle is going to get harder and worse as we go because the chips are not yet down, the real issues are yet to emerge. I've got a couple of questions. I hope we'll have some more from others coming in. And just really continuing a discussion we've been having all day in this webinar conference format around the politics of knowledge. Can you give us some examples or one example will do, I guess, about a politics of knowledge, which in your experience has been respectful and inclusive of diverse perspectives and knowledges, how that's worked out?
Yeah, is there an echo?
We're trying to demolish it. I think we're okay.
So one of the, examples that comes from, the Peter Wall Institute is that we tried to encourage the participants in the program to collaborate with different communities, and particular emphasis on Indigenous communities. But we also had funding opportunities and support for Indigenous-led research and resurgence. So we had a particular focus on COP27. We had an international Indigenous scholar who is with us from the Hunikui Nation, and we supported him in his sort of efforts at COP to draw attention, in particular to false solutions. He's very much an activist around the harms of carbon trading for many Indigenous communities, especially in the global South. So really sort of centering his perspective and funneling resources toward that, understanding that it's not just that, as is usually the case, we think that if we're going to do collaborations, that university researchers are the ones leading it, right? That we have the knowledge and that we then incorporate the knowledge of our collaborators in really extractive ways, and rarely viewing them as equal producers of knowledge. But in this case, we tried to say, well, there are certain places for collaboration and co-knowledge production, and there are other times when we can simply allow communities to continue, support them financially to do the research that they're already doing about the climate and nature emergency, and really centering that in our work and treating it as equally important as the knowledge produced by the scholars that are participating in the program, for instance. And that is really, it's much easier said than done, right? The extent to which people respect that knowledge equally. I think on the surface, it's easy enough for people to say that we're valuing all knowledges equally, but we can see in practice, in terms of what is funded, in terms of what gets heard at COP and other intra-national institutions, as well as in the university, that certain knowledges still are much more highly valued than others. And I think kind of inviting people into a continued practice of interrupting that and seeing that, and actually seeing that they're missing a lot, right? There is a lot of knowledge that is central to addressing the climate and nature emergency that we're totally ignoring in the mainstream, and to everyone's sort of detriment, but in particular the communities that hold it.
Thanks, Sharon. Let me bring in Christian Sadowski at this point.
Okay. Sorry. Hello. Sorry, it's me. Thank you very much for this presentation. Yeah, we have, like the problem with the connection. First of all, thank you for making it so technologically friendly. Like it was super impressive to be able to contact with a human being so powerful like you, not with the PowerPoint. But yeah, my question is also related to the issue of power. Like your 7 steps are really great for like people in the global north who need to step back and resign from their privilege. But as far as I understand, they are, and I find myself not a part of a global north, I'm a part of a global post-socialist east. And as far as I can see, people are not very eager to listen, not to say taking step backs. Maybe this, maybe you can recommend some, like parallel strategy, more proactive for the people in the global south. And also my question is whether you consider that any change, like going beyond business as usual, is possible without an open global conflict. Yeah, maybe, yeah, you have strategies that are consensual. Maybe there is a way, but I would be interested. What would you say?
Yeah, so thank you for pointing that out. So the steps are specifically designed for context in the global north. And I think one of the kind of commitments of the research collective Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures is to really emphasize that there are no universal exercises or strategies or pedagogies. It very much depends on the context. And it's actually quite tricky. I don't know how it is in your university context, but we have a lot of contexts that contain many different communities, right? And the reality is that certain interventions pedagogically that are most effective for some communities are actually pedagogically harmful for others, and vice versa. So another element of our Peter Wall programming was actually to have certain spaces where we did caucus, for instance, between white folks and people of color. Because although we were talking about the same general issues, they land very differently in people's bodies, right? And although, for instance, white folks need a place where we can really honestly and openly address our own complicity in harm, hearing that over and over again for people of color can be re-traumatizing. So I think it's very much the case that we need different conversations and different sets of tools for the contexts we work with. And a lot of the tools that we actually created in the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective are informed by the analyses of our Indigenous partners in Brazil, where they say, we have our own work that we want to do, and it's great. We love to have your support to do what we need to do, especially financially. You all have a lot of work that you need to do in your context so that you stop creating harm for us. So we have this kind of agreement that we, on the one hand, support the kind of research and inquiry they're doing, and they kind of offer their insight as to what we need to do in our context so that we're doing parallel work toward hopefully the possibility of different future. As for, whether we need conflict or not, I think in a way, it's already happening. Like there are already many conflicts and there will be more. So I'm not so not necessarily an advocate of creating more conflict. I think it's going to emerge. And the question is, how are we going to respond to it? I think particularly as people who have been used to having lots of luxuries and niceties and comforts, if those cease, there's going to be a lot of frustration and desperation perhaps. And I think for me and for the work that I do collectively, it's very much about trying to prepare people to develop the sort of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability so that now, but also when those crises happen in particular, our first instinct isn't to grasp on to everything that we had before, because we already know the costs of that. We know it's unsustainable. We know that it's harming people. And instead of viewing it as an opportunity or a time to reclaim that, rather saying, this is an opportunity to do things really differently, and trying to not use the moralizing framework, but rather show people that they're missing out on a lot of different possibilities that could be different. And they're not going to have, it's like they will lose something. They'll lose the things that they think they want and need, but other things become possible that they couldn't imagine, and kind of using that as more of a carrot than the stick sort of moralizing approach, which in our experience doesn't necessarily work. When it does work, it's not necessarily sustainable, and it can have the opposite effect, right? When people get really defensive and get their backs up. So that's just what works in our context, where we're trying to see if it works, but it will really depend on where you're at.
And our next question's from Vedika Kedia.
Hi, Simon. This is Olga Munsa. I'm not sure if this Vedika.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry for the technical disruption. Yes, thank you so much, Sharon, for the wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask about how do you grapple with this idea of bringing in climate concepts of climate justice, etc., in a university space, which also has, which also is to a certain extent, which also creates very tangible lines between haves and have-nots, and to an extent is a place for elites themselves, right? And so within these lines that is created, or divisions created between people who can access universities and people who cannot are most likely to be victims, or the most immediate victims of climate injustices. So even if you were able to achieve success within this particular academic program that you were talking about, how do you think it would translate to meaningful outcomes or changes within the larger society, which is more vulnerable to climate change?
Yeah, I think, well, it's hard to know, right, the impact of these kinds of interventions in the short term, right? The idea is to partly invite and experiment with the possibility of having people who are in these elite spaces actually use their resources and their power to support community-led interventions, community-led research. And then part of it in this context was just people learning how difficult that actually was, that you can't rush it, for instance. Although we have these very narrow timelines in the academic space, you have to move at the speed of trust when it comes to community relationships. So really it was partly about building people's capacity so that the possibility of meaningful outcomes become viable. But I think that is kind of the emphasis of the reparations, is that instead of the university always being the arbiter of what is valuable, what is important, is actually trying to funnel these resources directly to communities so that they can lead their own approaches to transformation. And if they want researchers and the university involved, then figuring out how to do that. And if they want to say, you know what, you've done enough, we don't actually want to have you involved, we just want the resources that are owed to us because of the histories of your institution, we are trying to find ways for that. And that also includes trying to figure out what kind of framing can be compelling for universities and administrators to want to do that, right? The moral argument doesn't work very well at the institutional level. It has to be sort of what are the opportunities? Or what are the threats if you don't? Because there are more and more social movements and critical literature as well, trying to advocate for reparations and restitution. And if universities find themselves behind the curve on that, it can damage their reputations, for instance. So trying to use those arguments to try and move things at the institutional level, obviously slower than we would probably like, but seeing if there are ways to mobilize action, and understanding that we need different kinds of critiques and interventions. I can share in the chat sort of another cartography that tries to map different spaces for intervention at the university level, understanding that we need the people, occupying the president's office. We also need the person who's going to whisper in the president's ear. And if we can actually coordinate across those different interventions, we would probably be even more effective. But understanding that at its core, the university is colonial and capitalist, And it might be impossible to change that, but for as long as we're here, what can we potentially do and learn by seeing with these kinds of experiments, what's possible?
Great answer, Sharon. Can we bring in Olga now? Olga Mann, who's on iPhone. That's her name in the chat.
Yeah, sorry for the confusion. Yeah, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Sharon. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I think this was one of the most important books that I've ever read, perhaps so far. So, and I had a question, and I particularly like that in your talk today and in the book, you highlight the importance of the Global North epidemic. And sorry for the noise in my background. So I have a question. Given the disproportionate impact, let's say, of the Global North societies into climate change, and my worry is that in talking about alternatives, Global North universities, they will engage in, let's say, climate change discussions, but most of that research would be funded through international student fees. So in a way, the materially, this kind of exploitative aspect of higher education, international higher education, will stay in place, and then it will be used for national development. So how can we build these conversations internationally between institutions, but that will also reflect on material changes that will perhaps be not beneficial for the universities themselves that participate in this system? Is there a way to engage universities in trying to change themselves, I guess, in Global North first?
I mean, that's what we're trying to find out. I don't think we know yet. And I think what we're trying to do, or my approach and the approach of the collective that I work with, is like work in the cracks of the institution. And like, again, that there's like multiple layers of that. There's the layer of, well, there's certain resources we can kind of repurpose right now, to the communities that we work with. There are experiments at the institutional level that we can try to see whether and how it's possible to convince administrators that it's actually in their interest to pursue this, right? For instance, there's an obsession in the university with competition, but something like climate change that's how we got into that mess, right? So saying, what if we actually did collaborate, starting perhaps more locally with other universities here, but then between the Global North and South. But I think the biggest kind of thing that for me is my focus, which is not the only focus, is like, number one, how to build these capacities so that people can actually start to notice these patterns, because they're so naturalized that although even when we intellectually notice the inequality between Global North and South relations in the university, in practice, we tend to reproduce them. So how can we get people to develop the kind of radar so that they can see when it's happening and know how to interrupt it? And in the meantime, figure out how to funnel more resources out of the university, again, by trying to, at least for now, convince them that it's in their best interest to do this work. And there's actually a lot of opportunity, not only for the reputation of the university, but also opportunity for learning, right? For actually thinking about knowledge in a transdisciplinary way, where it's not just across disciplines in the universities, but including community knowledges in that. But again, emphasizing the difficulty of that, right? Because almost always in those contexts, power relations are introduced. So number one, trying the practical pieces, but number two, trying to develop those radars for seeing how in practice, the same thing tends to happen over and over again. And it's really frustrating that we see it happening over and over again, but I don't know if there's another way, right? It's hard to fast track that. We have to keep moving, but understand that people are learning at their own pace, and just kind of holding that tension, and also holding the fact that the slow pace of learning for academics in the Global North does have negative implications for communities, particularly in the Global South, of saying that tension. We have to respect the pace of your learning, but there's a huge cost involved. So how do we think about those things together? But it's a great question that you have, and it's one I share too, and I don't have an easy answer, unfortunately.
And our last question is from Lily Yang.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Sharon, for the really inspiring presentation. And I think I see a lot of potential from your 3-step forward and back. So I'm wondering, on the one hand, we have this university playing a public role and playing a more proactive role in the community, and perhaps not in the local community, but at a global level. And we see the existence of diversity of approaches to sustainability and indigenous knowledge and approaches. I'm wondering if we're going back to the education role function of universities and how we might be able to incorporate those different indigenous approaches into our education of students, because students are the future generations who will be playing important roles that can be in more coordinate connection with the university public role, with in interacting with the community and the global community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. It's such a great point, and it's one of the sort of arguments that I try to use with colleagues and administrators as well, which is that students want to talk about these things and they are bringing critical perspectives, and we ignore that to our detriment, right? Because otherwise they start thinking this education is irrelevant. I've had students, tell me that they think the university is a scam because what they're learning is suited for another era, not the era in which we find ourselves. That's one of the reasons why we really emphasize the intergenerational component of the program that I was talking about, and trying to specifically create opportunities where students were centered and that the other participants in the program were invited to engage. Like we had these connections lunches where all the cohorts met together, and at least a couple of them students led. They put these questions on the table for the faculty and the staff and the emeriti to consider. And it was quite disruptive for the older generations to hear these questions, these frank questions coming from students, but trying to develop the generosity on both sides of the intergenerational divides to actually see that there's something that both sides are missing, right? That's why we have the stepping back piece about stepping back from your generational cohort, and then reminding younger generations too that at some point they will be the older generations and they will have to respond to younger generations, and really trying to think about our responsibilities across time, across species too. And I think the students are bringing, they're not as patient, right, as some people might hope they were. And although their demands aren't always met, they usually aren't by the university, it usually moves something, right? So that's what I try to also remind them. It's like, you might ask for this, you may not get that, but your requests are moving something. And then what we do as faculty to mobilize that can allow other things to move. So I think we need everybody, right? And I think we are not very good at valuing difference at this point because we're so polarized. But how do we, respect each other and each other's being, even if we disrespect each other's ideas? We've lost that capacity, or maybe we never had it, I don't know. But I think if we're going to face these wicked challenges together, we're going to need to find another way to relate apart from just relating only with those who agree with us. And I think students are a great reminder of that, and they're inviting us to do that work, even when it's uncomfortable for older generations to do that. So thank you so much, Lily. It's a great point.
And thank you, Sharon. It's been really good having this hour with you. It's been wonderful. And I mean, books changes, papers we read changes too. And I think that really important presentations and speeches, papers changes as well. Today we've had the opportunity to speak with you and also Rebecca Schendel and David Mills earlier. And I think all of those presentations have the capacity to enable us to see ourselves differently and maybe leave us all a bit changed. Humbling and happy experience it's been. So higher education, as a set of institutions, lots of problems, very much part of the social order, very much part of the capitalist and colonial order that you've talked about. They do provide us with these spaces to share and to learn and to respect each other and to build, to understand how we, can learn from difference, from otherness. And while they're there, we should use them as well as we can. And you've done that really well today for us. So the 7 steps back, the 7 steps sideways and forward, really helpful, and something we'll take away as one of the many things we'll take away from your presentation. So thank you. Now I think it's on my shoulders to close the conference and say what a good experience the 2 days have been. We've had keynotes from Alison Wolf and from Ellen Hazelcorn, Tristan McGowan on sustainability and higher education, Alice Wanchar, today David Mills, Rebecca Schendel, and Sharon Stein, and many good panels and project presentations as well. I think we got our gender balance right with the keynotes as 5 women, 2 men, but we didn't do it very well with diversity in terms of whiteness, and maybe that's something to think about pretty hard next year. We went backwards a bit from the previous year on that one. Look forward to one more conference in this current cycle of CGE next year. We look forward to your engagement and involvement in our twice-a-week webinar program. We'll be talking about these issues that Sharon's been talking about today more and more, I think, in the next 12 months. So thank you, Sharon. We're really learning a lot from your work, and it's really good to share your work with you. So to everyone, thank you very much for all of those who've made this happen, and especially to Mary Bowen-Perkins, who's held the webinar part of our conference together so well all day. And thank you also for all the colleagues in CG who facilitated the program and the discussion. And in the room I'm in here at Oxford, where several of the questions seem to come from today. Thank you very much for your participation, but thank you all folks out there for your engagement, and look forward to repeated viewings on YouTube of all the great presentations we had today. So until next year, but until the next webinar next week, it's bye for now.